Good day and welcome to SCO BRICS Insight, where we talk about the latest news, information and analysis of what's really going on in Russia and the BRICS. Now, my name is Rhod Mackenzie, and today I want to talk about how Beijing has now threatened the EU with a decisive response to the 18th package of anti-Russia sanctions, which have now included Chinese banks in the list. Now, this deterioration in relations between Brussels and Beijing is occurring on the eve of this Chinese-European summit, where the parties will seek a resolution to the trade war that's been initiated by the US. So why has the EU decided to take a more confrontational stance towards China? And what are the potential implications for the global economic system? Well, the Chinese Foreign Minister's official spokesman, Lin Jian, issued a statement expressing the Chinese government's strong disapproval of the 18th package of EU anti-Russian sanctions, which notably includes 3 Chinese banking institutions for the first time. Now, in diplomatic speak, that means they're mad as hell. Now, the restrictions affect the Souverain, Rural Commercial and the Haihe rural commercial banks, as well as 3 companies that, according to Brussels, have supplied products to Russia for the needs of the military-industrial complex. Now, these are supposedly dual-use products. Now, let's remember that washing machine chips and brooms are allegedly dual-use items, as the EU President Ursula von der Leyen claims Russia uses the chips to power their missiles and the brooms are used in hand-to-hand combat. Now, in this regard, Zhang again highlights Chinese consistent opposition to unilateral sanctions, emphasising that such measures lack any legal foundation as they're not endorsed by the UN Security Council. And of course, he's absolutely correct, and the current sanctions put in place actually have no legal standing in international law, and they're only imposed by those who fear being cut off from the dollar by the US that forces them to comply. Now, he also emphasised that in the Ukraine crisis, Beijing has been and remains committed to mediation and the facilitation of negotiations and has never supplied weapons to either of the conflicting parties and strictly controls the export of dual-use goods. So in conclusion, the diplomat called on the EU to cease undermining the legitimate interests of Chinese companies without any factual basis, and assured that China will take the necessary measures to resolutely protect the legitimate rights and interests of its companies, according to the website of the People's Republic of China. Now, before I continue, I would like to make an appeal. If you like and enjoy my videos, you can help me fund the channel and my website, SCOBRICSinsight.com, and contribute to their further development. Now, you can do this by making a small donation, which you can do by clicking on the thanks button at the bottom of the video screen. Everybody who donates gets a personal thank you from me, and do keep the comments coming. Do love to read them, do love to respond to them, and I'm trying to build a community with you all. Now, it's worth noting that the rhetoric has hardened against the backdrop of the up-and-coming summit in Beijing, which is dedicated to the 50th anniversary of Europe's diplomatic relations with China. Now, on Thursday, Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, and Antonio Costa, who I've never heard of, who's allegedly President of the European Council, are expected to meet Xi Jinping, the President of China. Now, the agenda for the meeting includes a discussion of ways to ensure a more balanced, reciprocal and mutually beneficial trade relationship. Now, according to the Grey Lady, the New York Times, China has decided to take retaliatory measures against the trade restrictions and has accused Europe of protectionism and slowed the export of certain essential minerals, plus it's moving even closer to Russia. Now, according to the newspaper's analysts, these measures are part of Beijing's tough stance in the trade and geopolitical disputes with Brussels. Now, the publication also recalls that von der Leyen previously accused China of flooding world markets with cheap goods which are intended to destroy competitors and of discriminating against European companies doing business in China. Now, she also expressed concern over China's support for Russia, stating that contributes to instability in Europe, although arming Ukraine and throwing everything at it by the EU obviously doesn't do that. Meanwhile, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has already issued a warning to the EU's diplomatic Russophobe chief Kaja Kallas regarding the potential consequences of sanctioning these Chinese banks. Now, according to the South China Morning Post, the Chinese diplomat 3 or 4 times emphasised to the European side of the consequences of this decision. In other words, he says, we're really going to hurt you badly for doing this. Now, last Friday, the EU's permanent representatives reached a consensus on the 18th package of 8 anti-Russian sanctions. Now, in response to the recent developments, the Kremlin's official spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, made the following statement. He said Russia has demonstrated resilience in the face of the sanctions pressure and exhibiting a high degree of immunity now to Western sanctions. It has the capacity to operate within all the restrictions they attempt to impose. In turn, the deputy head of the Russian Foreign Ministry, Alexander Grushko, said the possibility of zero out any trade turnover was an option. According to analysts, the relationships now between China and the EU have reached an impasse. The imposition of sanctions and the making of political demands by Brussels has prompted a robust response from Beijing. Now, in order for us not to appear weak, China is obliged now to strike a balance between its retaliatory measures and minimising any potential losses. So I would expect some fireworks from Beijing and the EU to get burnt by some of its reckless decisions. I expect that certainly military action will help. Conversely, the EU should fully endorse the US trade war, and that could result in damage to the global economy and being divided into competing blocs. For Europe, whose economic reliance on China is greater than its dependence on the US, this scenario is a significant threat to its economic stability. For a long time, the economic partnership between China and Brussels was structured in a way that European companies invested in China and exported the profits back and did very well, particularly from the export side of things. Now, this scheme suited China, according to Stanislav Tkachenko, who's a professor of international relations at St. Petersburg University and is also a member of the Valdai Club. He said the EU's recent actions, including the implementation of sanctions and various demands, as an attempt to politicise the current economic situation and the cooperation. So in turn, China understands that any restrictions, even in relation to small banks, will have a detrimental effect if they are cascaded through the Chinese economy. So any concessions made by Beijing will then be interpreted by the West as a sign of weakness, so it isn't going to do that. I mean, after all, in China, they understand this. So in light of these developments, China finds itself in the situation where it's really got to issue preemptive statements. Now, these statements are not yet specific, since the Chinese government is still trying to determine the right tone of its response. However, at the EU-China summit coming up, Beijing's rhetoric is going to be quite tough. Now, it's acknowledged that China will work in accordance with its principles, which is no one is allowed to get away with taking the piss out of them, and they'll retaliate against those who've caused them harm, while attempting still to minimise any losses. But at the end of the day, the EU needs China more than China needs the EU. China's economic relations are always characterised by a pragmatic attitude, and the concept of having friendships with other nations is not a central tenet to its foreign policy. So therefore, it's seriously improbable that Brussels will succeed in persuading Beijing to take joint action against Moscow along with the EU, or indeed against Chinese economic interests that it has with Russia. I mean, the European Union has made significant missteps now by imposing sanctions against China prior to the summit. It was a bit stupid. Now, Beijing has now perceived this decision by Brussels as a form of blackmail, according to the German political scientist Alexander Rhod. Now, according to him, China can now expect the EU to join the tariff war that the US intends to start and continue against China on countries that continue to cooperate and support Russia with buying oil and products, etc. These developments would be the end of economic globalization in their current form, and the world's now going to be divided into opposing blocs, the US and the BRICS. Perhaps this is exactly what the US is trying to achieve, but Europe, which depends on China more than it does Europe, this is a path to disaster. Anyway, that's the situation. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, and also share with others who might enjoy the videos. And if you want to make a donation, click on the thanks button at the bottom of the video screen. Thank you.